How dark is too dark for a book to go? I'm no stranger to dark stories or to bleak fiction. In fact, I often seek it out because I think that when you're challenged as a reader, you're actually rewarded as a reader. But I recently read two devastatingly dark books. One of them had an underpinning of hope, and I came away with it actually feeling rewarded and feeling kind of light. And the other one was just too much. I felt that it just pushed too far. I felt that the darkness in the book was actually damaging, that it held the book back. It felt wrong, and at the end of it, I just wanted to take a shower. So those books are Doggerland by Benjamin Smith, and the other book is this, 1977 by David Peace. So I'm going to talk about these two different books, how they use darkness differently, and why it's something to take into consideration. So the first book I'm going to talk about, this one, 1977 by David Peace. This is the second book in his Red Riding Quartet, and this book picks up 3 years after the first book, which is called 1974. In the first book, there's someone who's apprehended, someone who's referred to as the Yorkshire Ripper. I realize I pronounced that incorrectly. I'm from America, so there you go. The Yorkshire Ripper is a serial killer of adolescent girls. And at the end of that book, it seems that they've caught the killer. They kind of unveil a killing den. I'm not going to reveal too much more. I mean, it's not a huge plot secret to give that away, but you have to understand that to understand this book. So at the beginning of this book, it seems that this killer is back, and there's been a series of killings and some clues and things like that that are very similar. And in fact, there's some communication now from the killer, from the Yorkshire Ripper. The book is very, very, very different from the first one, though, in a few key ways. So this book follows two main characters, a reporter and an investigator, and they're both caught up in this sort of like really frantic process of trying to identify who this killer is, trying to prevent others from being killed. And that's because he's targeting prostitutes. And that's going to come in a second. The whole story, though, is really caught up in corruption, and it becomes a much larger tale of moral corruption. So we follow these two main characters, and the investigation is really marred by corruption within the police force and within local politics, but also within the greed and the very base desires of the people who have been tasked with trying to find this killer. So there's an incredible amount of irony there. It works on some levels for me because it's written in a very hard-boiled style, which the first book, 1974, also is. And when I say that, what I mean is, like, think about James Ellroy and these sort of like telegram type sentences that are just kind of telling you what happens. I like David Peace's writing more than I like Ellroy's writing, because David Peace will also go into the character and examine more interior monologue and more of the sort of moral landscape within characters, I think, than Ellroy typically does. This book also uses a very interesting narrative technique. It's nothing shockingly new, but it works for this kind of story. Each chapter is told from a different point of view of one of the two main characters. So one chapter is from the reporter, one chapter is from the investigator, and then it alternates back and forth. And as you would expect with that kind of narrative device, the two do converge at one point in the story, and then suddenly they're both working towards the same aim, but told from two different points of view. The characters are quite similar, and I actually found them to be kind of confusing at times because they both have the same flaws, and that links back to what I referenced earlier. So this killer now is targeting prostitutes. And both of these main characters are wanting and trying to have relationships with prostitutes and kind of like wanting to marry them. And at the same time, obviously just torching their own marriages. They have their own families, their own relationships and things like that. And they're just throwing that away to have relationships with these prostitutes. And that's where the book kind of, in my opinion, just goes off the rails because it's just too graphic. It's just too explicit. There is an incredible amount of violence in this story, and it's sexual violence. There's assault. There's sexual assault, and there's a ton of it. I mean, it's like almost a constant thing throughout the entire book. And from almost all the male characters are committing some kind of physical assault on each other or some kind of sexual violence. And it's just really pathetic, in my opinion. The two main characters, like I said, they have these relationships with these prostitutes, but then at the same time, they assault these women, and it's just too much. It's just all like really, like, it's almost like adolescent and childish, but also in like a really horrible and horrific way. And I get it. I get the point. The point, at least I think the point was that these two men are just a heartbeat away from being the next Ripper or the next, serial killer of women, particularly of prostitutes. And they're both agents of chaos. And there's an irony to that because they're supposed to be trying to restore some kind of order to a very chaotic world, the chaos that the Ripper has supposedly introduced to the world. They are also perpetrating basically the same type of crime. They just don't go that as far as the Ripper goes, with also having a gruesome murder to go with it. Okay, so maybe that was a bit too much, but this book is also just a bit too much. And in my opinion, all of that violence, all of that very graphic material really kind of ruined the book. The previous book, 1974, goes to some really dark places. And in fact, with a much wider range of characters, many of those characters are people who are very vulnerable in society, but it was able to do it without ruining the book and without damaging the reader. But in 1977, it's just constantly hammered out on the page, and there's just nothing to balance it out. There's no hope. There's no beauty. It's just this constant darkness, and it's so grim. In 1974, that book used the darkness as a kind of inverse flashlight, if you will. So the more the darkness was revealed, even more darkness was revealed. And it revealed this sort of very sinister conspiracy that involved the police and the church, social institutions, and local people who are all involved in some way with these killings. Whereas in 1977, that kind of conspiracy isn't really revealed. It's really just these two guys and all these horrible people that they're involved with. And they just commit all of these horrible, horrible acts, thinking that they're, some kind of white knight, I guess, with it. So I guess the point of all of that was that the explicitness in 1977 is really just kind of shocking. And I felt that he just went way too far with it, and that in going that far with it, it loses its greater purpose, which would be to kind of reveal a world to the reader that the reader may not normally be exposed to or aware of. In other words, I came away with it just wanting to take a shower. It just was like, I felt ultimately really disappointed with it. It's one of the few books that I've finished, and I've kind of felt like, okay, why did I go that far with it? Why did I finish it? Why didn't I just put it aside and say, that's not for me? And I guess I want to add that to this before everyone gets upset. You might be okay with this kind of book. You might think it's not that bad. You might think it's not that shocking. You might think it serves a higher purpose. I just didn't. And that's kind of the point that I wanted to explore in this video. Now, in contrast to that, this book, Doggerland by Ben Smith, this was a fantastic book, very, very bleak, but a very, very kind of different book. So to give you a quick overview of this is kind of a speculative fiction. You might even classify it as like climate fiction. I think it just falls within science fiction, but it's kind of speculative fiction, maybe in the vein of, I want to say J.G. Ballard, although it doesn't have a lot of the high weirdness that J.G. Ballard has. So what this is this is set in a future. We don't know when it is. We don't know exactly where it is. It's possibly like maybe the northern England, maybe Europe. We're not exactly sure. There has been a lot of flooding and extreme climate change. And there's a man, an older man and a younger man, although the younger man is just referred to as the boy. And They are basically mechanics or maintenance technicians in a wind farm. And the wind farm itself has been flooded. So they have to move around the wind farm on a boat. And the wind farm is in extreme decline. They spend day after day after day fixing these turbines, which are the whole operation is probably operating at like 50% capacity, something like that. But it just keeps going. And they get these occasional visits from a supply boat. And there's references that they work for some kind of company. So the real story of it is that this boy is there because the father left. The boy's father left. So the boy had to take his place. And it was apparently a part of some kind of contract that the father had agreed to or signed to have this job. But he left, so the company took the boy to take his place. And he's been working in this wind farm basically since he was kind of like an adolescent. He doesn't have much memory of his father because it seems that when he grew up, he was on a mainland somewhere, or at least in a different area. And the father was here on the wind farm working. Slowly, it's revealed through some exchanges with the maintenance, not the maintenance, but like the supply boat that comes to resupply them, that the boy doesn't quite know the whole story about what happened with his father. And then the boy does some exploring and kind of finds some clues and thinks that it's possible that his father had not died, but had tried to kind of escape. I'm not going to give away too much more plot. It's actually a pretty short book, and it's a really great book. Sorry, I'm not showing it correctly. It's a very fast read, and it's a very compelling read. And that's what I want to talk about, is that although it is very bleak and very devastating, and it's very grim and gray, the landscape that they're occupying is just this sort of endless and unknowable waterscape. It's very grim, actually, and their life is really crap. They eat sort of like prefabbed protein and artificial fiber, and they just have this horrible, like really grim sort of almost like a Mad Max meets Waterworld kind of life. And it's balanced out with incredible descriptions of the landscape that they're in, this waterscape of the wind farm. And as the boy moves around the wind farm on a boat, he kind of explores some new areas that he hasn't been to. And again, it's just described with this great beauty. It's almost this like really lovely naturalist kind of prose. I'm a person who loves the water and loves being on the water. And I just really like that. I really found an affinity with it. And I also agree that there are times, like if you've ever lived near the ocean, there are times like during rain seasons when it can be a very menacing kind of environment. It can be a very grim, kind of bleak environment, depending on how you look at it, especially when like storms are coming in and stuff like that. And the way that's described in the book, really beautiful and really, really profound. And I found that to be a really interesting contrast to 1977, which had no beauty in it at all. There was no light within that darkness. Whereas in Doggerland, there is a lot of light within the kind of darkness. You could kind of, I guess in some ways, you could kind of compare it to The Road, in that it's an old man and a boy, and they're kind of the last two people on the earth, and the other people they encounter have a very questionable moral compass, but those are kind of where the parallels end. It's not post-apocalyptic in the way that The Road is, and it's not an examination of how humans will destroy each other the way that The Road is. It's a much more hopeful book, and I'm going to get myself in trouble here. I think it's a better book than The Road. I'm not a huge McCarthy fan, not a huge fan of The Road. That's a different video. But I just found this book, like I said, to really have an underpinning of lightness and of hope to it that really balances out that darkness that 1977 just was lacking. So my point in all of this is that dark books are useful when they teach us and when they touch us and when they compel us to find the light. And when they show us characters who move through the darkness to find the light and to find the hope and to find a way to keep going and to keep living. And I found that within Doggerland. Great book, highly recommended. I did not find that in 1974 by David Peace. So there you go. So two very, very dark books that do two very different kinds of things with the darkness. So if you're a fan of either of these books, if you're a reader of dark fiction and you kind of have some other thoughts about why you think darkness can be useful in a book, please leave a comment below, and be interesting to get some comments and some feedback from people. And in case you don't know, my name is Carl, and this has been Please Read Your Book.